Welcome to another episode of the Not Another Yoga Class podcast and LinkedIn live series. Today we have a very special guest. We have my mate Shona Hirons, who is here to talk all about the menopause and her experience going through menopause at work and how it affected her. So, Shona, if you could give us a mini intro into who you are and what you do.
Okay. Hi. Thank you so much for having me, Jamie. So my name's Shona Hirons, and I'm a behavior nutrition and fitness coach. And I kind of say born again into that. I was a lawyer for 20 years, and I do what I do because of the things that have happened to me in my life experience.
Amazing. Okay, so let's kind of break down a little bit about what you were doing, because I think anybody that's been on LinkedIn for a while knows what you do because you're a big presence on LinkedIn. What I'm really curious about is what about that law career and kind of how it ended. So if you give us a little bit of background into that.
So there were a few things. I mean, I up until the age of 33, I was told I couldn't have children. So during my 20s and early 30s, I did throw myself into my career and actually made it quite senior very quickly. And I did thrive on that. I am someone who does thrive on a bit of stress, and I think a lot of people do. But it's when that stress starts to interfere with your daily life and you don't have enough resources. You know, you think of it as a bucket of water with a hole in it, and every time a tap is leaking, is filling that bucket up. And, you know, now and again, that water's coming out with that little hole you've got in the bucket. But then when things get too much, it spills over. And that's where things turn into overwhelm and catastrophizing. And part of it as well was down to my own mindset. I had a very perfectionist mindset. And if things didn't quite go to plan, or if I didn't win a case or something, I would beat myself up for weeks. And that really wasn't serving me very well, and actually having a more negative impact on and holding me back, probably. But I've only kind of realized that over the last couple of years. But the culture where I worked, they did kind of give their staff this badge of honor. You know, it was the people who got the best bonuses, the sort of employee of the quarter awards, were those who worked well into their social time. So stayed behind for a couple of hours, at least 2 or 3 hours in an evening, gave up their weekends. And I didn't mind doing that. And then when I was 33, I discovered that the reason I couldn't have children was because I had a hole in my heart, had that closed up, and then within a few months I fell pregnant with my now nearly 17-year-old daughter. And that was when my priorities around work changed. You know, I when she started reaching school age, I wanted to be that mum who was at the school gates, even if it was just once a week, just so that I could drop her off and pick her up. That was really important to me, and I wanted that balance. And this was sort of 2011, 2012. And, you know, I'd like to have thought by then most workplaces, specifically in the UK, were flexible enough to allow that. So I did put in a request for flexible working, and it was granted. And at the same time, we had a new boss come in, and his values were very, very different to mine. His view was, when a woman has a baby, she should make a choice. She should either have a career or be a mother, and you couldn't have both. And he made my life very, very difficult. I had the same targets as the full-timers, and it almost became the opposite way for me. I mean, I found myself working 80-hour weeks. I wasn't allowed to take any work home with me. And I literally changed. My whole life changed in the space of about 10 months. But it happened very, very, very quickly. And, you know, I stopped doing all the things I loved doing. I'd always been really into my fitness and gone to the gym several times a week. And I stopped doing that because there wasn't time. I wasn't taking my breaks at work. I'd literally come into work, head down like a periscope, and I would stay there for hour after hour. The only time I would ever even think about leaving my desk was to go and get another coffee or an unhealthy snack from the vending machine. And I had no idea what this was doing to not just my mind, but my body as well. And I became this very negative person. I struggled with self-doubt. definitely stopped believing in myself, and that had a massive impact on me as a person, and also my performance at work. And I started making mistakes, and I know this isn't about this, but this is like a bit of the background. That led to me becoming very, very burnt out. But nobody used words like burnout a decade ago, or a little over a decade ago. It was still thought of as a buzzword, and no one had once ever said to me, "You just need to slow down." And I was getting all these weird physical symptoms, like losing the feeling in my hands. They would claw in on me like a claw shape, and I'd have no feeling in them. My feet would feel like they were in a bunch of stinging nettles. And I started having panic attacks, and I'd never had a panic attack before, and I'd no idea what to expect. And I honestly thought I was dying. And having had a heart problem a few years earlier, having these pains in my chest and losing the feeling in my left side of my body, it was. And in May 2013, I collapsed, and I was rushed to hospital and had all these tests done. And I remember never feeling so unwell. And after about 5 hours, the doctor coming out and saying, "Oh, Mrs. Hirons, we've got good news. Your test results are normal. There's nothing wrong with you." But that didn't feel like good news, because not that I wanted to have something wrong with me, but I just knew my body. I knew this wasn't me. And I got home, and I remember it taking every ounce of energy for me to walk up the stairs and get into bed. And that's where I stayed for the next 3 weeks.
Wow.
But at the same time, my boss was constantly on the phone to my husband saying, "When is she coming back to work? There's nothing wrong with her." So I felt under pressure to go back. And it just got worse and worse. I felt, by the end of 2013, I felt like such a failure. I felt completely worthless. I felt like I was pathetic at my job, being pathetic as a mum, as a partner, as a friend, as a daughter. And I felt like I'd lost everything. And I literally just walked out, and I didn't have another job to go to. I didn't feel like I was good enough to apply for any other kind of job in law, because I just felt like such a failure. I was really at rock bottom. And that was when I started to find my love for fitness again, and just really threw myself into the gym, but started off small, because the idea of going for like an hour-long session in a gym, I just thought, I can't do it. I had no energy at all. So I just started doing, 5-minute workouts here and there throughout the day. And that's kind of where my movement snacks were born, because I realized that just adding in small amounts of movement into the day and then building and building on it, it made a massive difference to my energy levels, my confidence. And that was when I started training as a personal trainer as well. I started off with a spin instructor, and then I carried on over the next couple of years. But that was never going to pay the bills. So I did actually go back into law for a while. And then in 2017, I kind of made the same mistake again, where I'd gone back into the corporate world. And although I'd started looking after myself and adding in good fitness and looking after my nutrition, I hadn't learned healthy boundaries. I hadn't learned how to say no. And I've always been a bit of a people pleaser. And just sort of every time a new project came about, "Oh, would you like to take on this one? Would you like to do this one? Would you like to do the interviewing for new staff and all the training?" And I was just going, yes, yes, yes. And before I knew it, I was back up to working 60, 70-hour weeks. And the only thing I was doing different this time was, to keep up with my fitness, I was cycling into work every day. And 8 years ago, almost exactly, I was again trying to do everything, not only at work, but at home as well. I also felt like it was my job to do the childcare, the housework, the cooking, you name it. And I wouldn't let go. I wouldn't let anybody else help me. And that is one of the biggest lessons I've learned, is just let go. And I had a very, very serious accident, which put me into an induced coma for a couple of weeks. And then I spent the next almost a year in and out of hospital, having major surgery and fighting for my life. And that made me question, if this was my last day on earth, would I be happy with what I've achieved? And my answer was no. And I knew something had to change, but I had no idea how to do it. And when I had my accident, my periods actually stopped overnight. And I didn't think much of it. I was, 42 at the time. I didn't think that much of it. And I did ask my GP about it, and he thought the extreme stress and trauma that I'd been through had maybe caused my periods to stop. And I did mention, could it be something to do with perimenopause? You know, I'd looked into that a little bit, and that was ruled out because he just said I was too young, and instead I was prescribed antidepressants, and I wasn't depressed. You know, I definitely wasn't. I was actually in a pretty good place at that point because I kind of almost discovered what my why was, what my passion was again, and knew that I needed to do something different. So I knew I wasn't depressed, but that's kind of the answer that's given if you're, you know, if you're classed as too young for menopause. But it's perimenopause, which I've discovered is when you get most of your symptoms. You know, I think it's important to understand it's a natural transition in a woman's life, but I'll come back onto that in a minute. When I returned to work after my accident, which was almost a year later, I actually thought I had dementia at times because I'd be halfway through a conversation with a client and just completely forget what I was talking about. And I had to keep on asking people to repeat themselves what they told me only a few minutes earlier. Several times I forgot my way to work and had to pull over to get my bearings. And then on one occasion, I was in the local pharmacy picking up a prescription, and I even forgot my address. And my daughter, who was, I think, eight years old at the time, had to tell them what our address was. And I just felt, you know, ridiculous. I didn't know what was happening. And then after 2 years of my periods stopping, they started again, but this time with a vengeance. So this would have been the beginning of 2019. They were like nothing I'd ever experienced before. I mean, you know, I know this sounds quite personal, but I didn't wear white for fear of flooding. I felt really dirty and was taking several showers every day. I was permanently hot and had sweat patches under my arms. I started getting late for meetings because I'd have to rush outside to wait out a hot flush. That also affected my sleep because I was always so hot during the night, and that was making me then feel sluggish and irritable during the day. And I felt really stupid. And I had a female line manager at the time, and she would keep pulling me to one side and say, when are we going to get the old Shona back? And I just didn't have the answers. That onus was put onto me. And then eventually she put me on a performance improvement plan. And it became really clear that nothing I did was going to be good enough.
Shona, at this point, were you aware of what was going on?
I'd started doing a bit of research because I thought, I know my body and this isn't right. And the doctors then sent me for blood tests, and that they were unclear. You could go for a blood test on a Monday morning and another set on a Tuesday morning. They'd give you different results. So I started to do, I got really interested in nutrition. So I started studying an advanced diploma in weight management and nutrition for what's classed as older people, which is 40 plus. And in that, I did a specialization in menopausal fitness and nutrition. And I just thought these are typical menopause symptoms. The difficulty I had was my doctor wouldn't even, you know, consider that and wouldn't put me on anything like HRT. But I had mentioned it to my workplace and said, look, you know, I'm pretty sure I'm going through early menopause or some sort of menopause. And that was just, again, ruled out. No, nothing was ever talked about. It was just like a passing comment. It wasn't taken as serious. And it did affect me because I felt really alone. And then I started looking for groups for support. So I went onto Facebook and started joining groups like perimenopause clubs and menopause advice. And I just found them so negative. They were full of women coming together. But one woman would make a comment about, you know, maybe having heavy periods or hot flushes or low sex drive. And then everybody else would just be negative on top of it. So it was just, I thought, this isn't for me. And I wanted to create an experience where people would have a joyful menopause and be able to find solutions rather than just moaning about it all the time. And the reason I found out in the end was because I'd also get very bloated, and eventually I was sent for a scan, and the scan revealed that I had 5 growths in my uterus the size of grapefruits. And I was lucky enough to have private cover through my husband's employment. And in the middle of July, I was sent for a biopsy and some other tests, and found out I had uterine cancer. And within a month, I had my womb removed, and thankfully they were able to curtail the cancer and get rid of it, which I found out on the day we went into lockdown in 2020. But again, the other thing with that was when I had my womb and my ovaries removed, I wasn't once told that I would be plunged straight into menopause. And that again was a massive shock to my symptom. I just seemed to, it was like everything happened all at once. The brain fog tripled. The hot flushes were literally ridiculous. We'd be sat in our front living room in the middle of winter, freezing cold outside, and I'd be there like going, "Oh my God, I'm boiling." And we'd have to open the patio doors, and my husband would be there with a blanket up to here, freezing. And I know I'm like sort of not laughing about it, but it's just not knowing how to manage it. But when I was doing my nutrition qualifications, I realized there is pretty much everything that we eat or drink can affect our symptoms. And it's not so much about what you take away from your food, it's more about what you add, and learning to become a scientist of your own body. And that's what I've done over the last few years, and that's what I've done now to help lots of other women and raise awareness in workplaces about that.
That's awesome. About workplaces, what is it that you think that workplaces could do better? You clearly didn't have a good experience when you were going through this. So what is it that workplaces could do more of or less of?
I think actually listening, it's interesting. I was talking to a company last week who said, "Oh, we do support menopause in the workplace because we've got a menopause support hub." And then I spoke to one of the HR ladies who started going to this menopause support group. And I said, "Oh, well, it's really good that they've got that." And she said, "No, it's the most toxic thing I've ever been to." And I went, "Oh, right, okay." And it sounded very similar to the Facebook groups that I was talking about. She said the problem is it is encouraging women to talk about it, but no one's got any solutions. So it's just a big moan fest. And for me, I think it needs to be solution focused. You need to be able to have someone that you can talk to who's either been through it or is aware of what you can do to help manage your symptoms, and not also treating it as a one case suits all. So, it's all good and well saying, "Oh, you have to take HRT." But HRT isn't for everyone. So it's important to look at the alternatives and raise awareness of what things can imbalance HRT as well. And so there's so many different things, and this is what I've learned. So I think having regular training, specifically with managers and leaders, on how to, one, recognize the obvious changes in people, but to make it a normal conversation, and not to make it take away that stigma. One fact is, the average age for a female CEO in the UK is age 55, whereas the average age for menopause is 51. And from what I've seen, it seems that just when a woman feels ready to step up the ladder, either her body starts to betray her, plus the lack of awareness and support in the workplace doesn't help either. And it doesn't have to be like that. It is possible to have a joyful menopause, but it does take understanding and support. And there are many, many things that women and workplaces can do to make symptoms bearable. And I think this is even more important these days, with women over the age of 50 being the fastest growing segment of the workforce. So action does need to be taken now.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, this has been really insightful, I think, and I'm hoping that there will be a little bit of drive towards awareness. It's amazing because I talk a lot about lots of different subjects, and there's always a theme. There's always an undercurrent to the solution, which is communication and awareness.
Yeah.
So this, I guess, is no different. And I guess the problem has been probably up until now is that it is a percentage of the demographic. And unfortunately, the percentage of the demographic that normally don't get the sort of awareness that they need. You know, we tend to focus on topics that affect the majorities, and that sidelines these types of things. We just did a conversation about neurodiversity. I think 20% of us are neurodiverse, and it was the same thing. It was, well, this is a minority thing, so it's probably, you know, 10, 20 years behind where it should be in terms of employers driving awareness towards it. So thank you so much for coming on and talking about it and giving us some insights.
Yeah, you're welcome. And I think, you know, final point on that is, you know, it's all good and well talking about it, but you can't just deal with it. Like, you can't just treat the symptom, you've got to deal with the cause. Otherwise, it's like putting a sticking plaster on it. So, you know, all employers, or most employers these days, are really hot on talking about inclusivity and diversity. And, you know, my view on that is, even if you employ just one female in your workplace, the chances are that she will experience some form of menopause or post-menopause symptoms during her career. So it's really important that a well planned out menopause policy is properly embedded into the culture. And continuous development is the key on that as well.
Brilliant. I totally agree. Thank you so much for coming on.
You're very welcome. Thanks for having me, Jamie.
Thanks, Shona.